Out here, the West ain't just dust and gun smoke, it's blood, betrayal, and legends carved in iron. These are the forgotten tales of outlaws, lawmen, and drifters chasing gold, vengeance, and redemption. Welcome to Dust and Iron Tales. Sunset bleeds over Cottonwood Creek as the wind threads through broken shutters. Jed Stone polishes a brass bell on the store door, counting the days like beads. The town's name is barely legible on the weathered sign, swallowed by sand and memory. The wind sings a mournful tune through broken timbers and empty wagons. Jed's face is a map of sunburnt lines. His eyes are faded denim blue, still hunting down trouble before it finds him. His store stocks memories more than goods, jars of dried berries, canned promises, and a ledger of losses. In the back room, Jed keeps his secret dream of a hidden obsidian vein, dark as a crow's wing, said to lie beneath the whispering peaks. The peaks loom like jagged teeth beyond the cottonwoods, and the wind carries whispers of a shadow lurking near. Caleb arrives, a boy in a tattered Union coat, his gaze haunted and his right arm stiff with old wounds. He asks about a shadow weaver, not gold, but a healer believed to hide among the peaks. Jed warns that legends in this belt of earth often circle back as trouble, and that the peaks bite. That night a dust storm raises Cottonwood Creek, tearing shingles and scattering memories like seed. In his store, Jed hears a pounding, and Caleb bursts in with a mapment, a symbol, a crude arrow drawn toward a jagged silhouette on the mountains. This symbol matches Jed's own dream, the trailhead to the obsidian vein, and a dangerous convergence of fates. We ride at dawn. Jed grunts, gripping the old prospecting pick that has never failed him, and he vows they will not split up. The dawn light bleeds pale gold as they ride out, the town shrinking behind them, the wind turning to a whispered chorus of warning. The whispering peaks loom closer, their faces carved with wind-scarred scars and ancient scars of old wars between earth and sky. They find the entrance to the vein where the obsidian glitters beneath loose rock, a vein shimmering with a glassy, cold fire that hums in their bones. In the heart of the vein, the shadow weaver reveals himself not as a man, but as a shadowed form that tests the motives, healing and theft braided together. The desert breathes, and Cottonwood Creek's last place quivers as Caleb's hunger for. Here in Jed's hunger for fortune confront what the mountains offer, either redemption or ruin, leaving them to choose what to carry back to the wind. The shadow weaver's form stretched like a heat mirage, a silhouette that inhaled the world and exhaled answers. It spoke through the vein's glassy hush, asking Caleb to reveal his true need and Jed to name the cost he would pay for what he saw. Caleb steadied his breath, confessing that healing mattered more than treasure, that the broken arm carried stories he could not forget. Jed, eyes narrowed, admitted that fortune had haunted his dreams long enough to feel like a second heartbeat in his chest. The shadow thickened, then chose to split itself into two currents, the one that could mend flesh and the one that could mend the old town's fever for gold. Caleb's arm trembled as a pale green light threaded through the wounded flesh and knit the sinews with patient, almost celestial speed. Yet with every thread of healing came a cost. The shadow weaver warned, and memory dropped from the sky like ash to balance the gift. Jed felt the veinness cold power slide into his own hands, promising the luck of the hills if he would swear it would never leave Cottonwood Creek. He hesitated, tasting the rust of years and the sweet bite of possibility, then chose to speak of stewardship rather than possession. The shadow steadied, and the whispering wind carried the scent of sage and old coins, a signal that a choice had been weighed and found wanting or willing. The obsidian glowed, not with fire but with a patient, ancient patience, as if the mountains themselves watched the bargain unfold. Caleb's wound healed, and the numbness along his shoulder receded into a steady, almost hopeful throb. But in the same breath, a memory of a fallen friend in a distant was slipped away from Caleb, leaving behind a hollowness that he did not yet understand. Jed's hands trembled less with age and more with the realization that some riches would corrode a person from the inside out if kept too long. The shadow weaver drew closer, not as judge or thief, but as a mirror showing what they would become if they carried the obsidian's power back to Cottonwood Creek. They saw the town as dust storms tempered by a wind that could cure, but only if wielded with the healer's restraint rather than a merchant's hunger. In a final breath, Caleb promised to guard the medicine and share it only with those who truly needed it, not those who merely desired comfort. Jed agreed to seal the entrance behind them with a vow that no one would mine the vein for profit, and that memory would outlast greed. When the shadow dissolved into a sigh of wind, the peaks settled, and the desert exhaled a long, quiet blessing over Cottonwood Creek. The two men walked back toward the ruined town, carrying a new weight that felt like mercy and a still sharp edge of caution, knowing the wind would test their choices every day from then on. The return trail shimmered with heat, and the mountains held their breath as if listening for what they decided. Jed looped the old prospecting pick behind his belt, his fingers remembering the light touch of iron against stone. Caleb walked a pace behind him, the sleeve of a torn Union coat stained and faded, yet his posture stubborn, almost defiant. Cottonwood Creek rose ahead, its ruin silhouetted jagged reminder against the pale sky, and a single door hung from its hinge like a tired eyelid. On the porch, a few tumbleweeds drifted, and the wind carried the faint scent of sage and old gunpowder. "We sealed it," Caleb said softly. "We kept the vein so no man could turn the mountain into a mine again." Jed nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting in a tired, secret smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Memory's the only currency that doesn't lose value," he rasped. But he didn't try to translate the thought for Caleb. They camped that night in a hollow behind the general store, the fire thin line of orange against the dark, listening to the wind trace and map of the town's regrets. The stars looked down as if through a crack in the ceiling of the world, and the whispering peaks hummed with a patient wind. Caleb pressed his palm to his chest, where the old wind still burned in the cool air, swearing to God the secret with his last breath. Jed spoke little, but when he did it was to warn the young man of the desert's memory, how it held a grudge against greed and forgetfulness. At dawn the two rode along the rim of Cottonwood Creek, the town shrinking behind them like a tired memory. In the peaks the slope breathed and shifted, stones rearranging as if the mountain itself tested their resolve. They found the path drawn through the vein dark, but instead of obsidian they entered a chamber where the air smelled of rain and old clay, there etched into a pane of black glass. Jed saw his own face beside the Shadow Weaver's, a warning and a blessing reflected back. The Shadow Weaver's presence lingered as a soft pressure, not a man but a memory testing their hearts with a quiet riddle. "Leave it buried," Caleb whispered, "and keep the cure for those who truly need it, not for those who would own it." Jed turned away, feeling the weight ease just enough to breathe, and lifted his pick as if saluting both the past and the future. When they descended back toward Cottonwood Creek, the wind carried a new sound, not the scream of greed but a lullaby of mercy, winding the town to the mountains in a path that might outlast the desert. The lullaby settled into the dust like a blessing, softening the rough edges of the town silhouette as they approached. Jed watched the boardwalks align in the morning light, splinters gleaming with a patient resilience. Caleb kept his gaze on the horizon, bandage over his wounded arm now feeling more like a memory than a wound. The warm air carried the scent of sage and rain that hadn't fallen in years. In the general store, the shelves seemed to sigh, as if remembering when goods came with promises. Childless wind chime on the porch of the tavern clanked in a rhythm that felt almost like a welcome. Jed laid the pick across the counter and whispered to the walls, "Let the old signs speak if they must." Caleb retrieved the map, tracing the symbol that had begun their fated bargain. The Shadow Weaver's echo pressed at the edge of their hearing, not to frighten but to guide, a listening presence. At the edge of town, a stray dog came out of the dust, nose quivering as if tasting rain that would never fall. The dog paused, then trotted toward Jed's booth, as if recognizing him as a keeper of something sacred. In the mountains beyond, the whispering peaks answered with a slow, resonant hum that vibrated in their ribs. He set out again, not with fury but with a measured patience, the way old miners learned to read the land. The obsidian vein, though conceived in myth, began to feel tangible, a dark pulse beneath their stepping feet. A sudden screech of raptors split the air, and Caleb steadied himself, blocking the moment. With humor, "We haven't even found a good fortune yet." Jed smiled, and, for once, his eyes sparkled with something beyond stern caution, a spark of adventure that remembered joy. They crossed the last switchback and found the entrance to a fissure where heat breathed from the rock like a living thing. The Shadow Weaver's memory stepped closer, a silhouette of feathers and smoke, offering a riddle. What is buried is not always forgotten. What is found is not always kept. Jed knelt, his hand hovering over the ground, and Caleb lowered the map, choosing to trust the moment rather than the plan. They stepped into the air that smelled of old stone and possible cures, ready to choose mercy over greed, and to let the mountains decide their fates. The path steepened, and the wind shed the last of its warmth as boulders hissed with cold. Caleb pressed forward, the map creasing in his gloved hand, while Jed kept pace with measured steps. At the lip of a shale ledge, the whispering peaks opened like a sleeping creature, ash at their feet and a scent of wet copper in the air. A circle of charcoal stumps lay where fires once warmed men, and in the center, a sheen of obsidian shards pulsed with a pulse of their own. The Shadow Weaver's memory rose again, feathers, smoke, and a soft voice naming the riddle. What is buried is not always forgotten. What is found is not always kept. Jed knelt, tracing a line in the gravel that matched the map's arrow, the dream returning not as a warning but as a map. Caleb tested the numbness in his arm, a stubborn ache that had learned to endure, and whispered that courage could be heavier than pain. They followed a narrow fissure that threaded into the heart of the peak, where the walls wore striations like old wound scabs. The air grew cooler, and a breath of something medicinal mint and rain and something darker slid across their skin. In a cave mouth carved by wind, a figure stood still as a rock, robes of grey-white dust swirling around him, eyes old and patient. The shadow weaver, or a man who wore his raiment, stepped closer without fear, and the silence between them filled with the hiss of a distant spring. He spoke in a voice that sounded like dry leaves brushing over a wooden flute, asking only that they offer a name for what they hope to bind to the world. Caleb spoke of healing his arm and of finding mercy for a town that had forgotten how to listen to the land's language, but Jed spoke of a bigger thing, the vein, the memory, and the dead owed to those who came before. The weaver pointed to the glimmering seam in the wall, where the obsidian glittered as if it held a small knight inside, and warned that the vein did not yield to greed but to reverence. A tremor ran through the rock, and from the stone there rose a scent like rain on hot iron, and the arrow on the map glowed faintly along its edge. They descended into a cavern where streams flowed with black water that tasted of wind and murk, and Jed found himself staring not at treasure but at a reflection of Cottonwood Creek in the glassy pool. The shadow weaver spoke of buried truths, the names kept in the ground, the promises carved into the peaks, and one that what is buried could still rise to claim a debt. Caleb laid his hand on the pool's edge and vowed to return with mercy rather than gold, while Jed pressed his pick into a crevasse and whispered that some things should stay and some things should be allowed to heal. From the depths came a chorus of wind through stone, and in that sound Jed heard the old town's voices, as if Cottonwood Creek itself spoke through the mountains. When they emerged into the daylight again, the dawn seemed a softened blade, and the sun's light fell on the obsidian vein as if it had chosen them, not them it, to carry a new balance between need and mercy. Path climbed through scrub and bone-dry washes, wind muttering through rock like an old storyteller. The peaks wore the sun's memory on their jagged faces, and the map's arrow glinted with a promise earned by sweat rather than luck. Caleb kept his gaze fixed on the mountain spine, while Jed scanned every ledge, listening for the faint creak of hidden stone. They found the entrance to the vein, a fissure split by ages, where obsidian gleamed black as a crow's eye. There around it hummed with a language Jed old enough to dream in, a vibration that sounded like rain in a drought. Caleb pressed his palm to the glass dark rock and felt the tremor travel up his arm as if the stone remembered his blood. A gust peeled off the mountain and scattered ash, and from the fissure came a whisper, not words, but weather directions, sympathies, warnings. Jed lowered his pick and listened to the mountains, the way Cottonwood Creek listened to a storm's rumour before it breaks. The arrow on the map pulsed once, then pointed in toward a shallow alcove where the veins converged like a heartbeat. In that alcove the obsidian sang, not with music but with memory, showing Jed faces of long-dead trappers and the town's ghosts begging for mercy or for closure. Caleb spoke at last of mercy, not gold, but the right use of power to mend what broke. The shadow weaver, or whatever kept vigil here, let them linger for a heartbeat, a figure of shadow at the corner of sight. A rumour made flesh for an instant. The ceiling brushed their heads with a glide of silver dust, and a low voice, not heard but felt, warned that healing comes with a price. Caleb stepped forward and offered the memory of his fallen comrade, a pledge not to take more than could be returned. Jed, heart cracking open like a geode, realized the vein's power would test the balance between desire and mercy, between taking and giving. He weighed the town's dream revival, work, companions for the long days ahead against the risk of turning sorrow into a commodity. The obsidian responded with a pulse that travelled up their legs and into their spines, a cold, minty thrill that sharpened their senses and their resolve. In the next breath, the shadow weaver appeared as a shimmer of shade and wind, asking a silent question, "What are you willing to lose?" Jed answered with the memory of Cottonwood Creek's last bell, when the town's ghost finally learned to yield to mercy, not just to memory. The cave fell quiet, the obsidian's luster receding to patient black, and Jed and Caleb stepped back, choosing to seal the entrance and bring back only mercy, not wealth, to the village that still waited in the heat and dust. The route back was a slow procession of heat and memory, the landscape brushing their nerves with wind-scratched grit. Caleb walked with the limp of his arm, but his other hand kept a quiet vigil on the map that no longer showed gold, only labels of mercy. The whispering peaks were quiet now, as if listening for what they wouldn't take from men who had learned to listen back. On a ledge they passed a wind-carved sculpture, a jagged figure that looked like a sleeping shadow. Caleb touched it and whispered, "Shadow Weaver, is that you?" The wind answered in a dry hiss, and Jed nodded, knowing that some voices belonged to the rocks, more than to living mouths. They found a small spring tucked in a crevice, running cool and clear, a sign perhaps that mercy could still be found in places that swore they'd starve you of water. Jed knelt and cupped water, letting Caleb drink first, the way old comrades do, giving up a little pride for a bigger trust. The map back in their sack developed new wrinkles, as if the desert itself pressed its own memory onto parchment. In the far basin, the dust haze canyon opened like a forgotten book, pages fluttering with the rustle of dry bones and old promises. A ribbon of shade slid down the slope, and for a moment Jed believed the whole mountain breathed that slow, tired sigh, as if agreeing to the truths they offered. Caleb spoke softly, saying that healing was never only a medicine, but also a story told to your own body until it believed it could mend. Jed, for his part, admitted that he carried Cottonwood Creek's last bell inside him, an echo that mercy could alas greed. The obsidian vein remained a black rumor behind them, like a memory that refused to be mined but could still be half remembered as a warning. They climbed until the peaks leveled into a high saddle where the wind tasted of pine and old gunpowder, where reckoning often happens. A pair of hawks rose from a crevasse and rode the thermals, as if heralds of a choice they were about to make. In the bowl below, Jed spotted the circle of smooth stones laid by someone long gone, a tiny shrine to safety rather than wealth, and he knelt without a word. He pressed his palm to the stones and whispered a pledge to Cottonwood Creek that he would defend its people with what mercy he still had left. Caleb placed a tattered map across the stones, as if offering the future to the town and asking the mountains to bless it or prick it gently if needed. When they turned back toward home, the peak shed a last glint of sun, and the desert ceased its tirade, leaving a pale, patient quiet in their wake. By the time they crested the final rise and looked down on Cottonwood Creek, the town silhouette had shifted in the heat like a memory breathing, and Jed knew the choice they'd made would see new mercy in the old town. No treasure required. The pair paused at the lip of the ridge, the town a smear of dust below and the peaks breathing slow. Caleb tightened the strap on his battered pack, ignoring the ache in his arm as if to prove the wound hadn't slowed him. Jed pressed his lips into a line, scanning the jagged silhouette for signs the whispering peaks might speak back. A thin wind carried the ghosts of bells and broken wagon wheels from Cottonwood Creek, and for a moment it sounded almost like a chorus. They descended into a pocket of shale that shimmered with tiny obsidian chips, the ground singing underfoot as if the stone remembered heat. The map texture in Caleb's palm loosened, and he whispered that the vein would open only to those who listened with honest intent. Jed grunted, thinking of the old tool shed beneath the store where he kept a hidden spade and a pocket mirror that reflected what the eye refused to see. As they pressed onward, ridges pulled away and a cedar break gave way to a hollow where the air tasted of rain that never fell. There, etched into a weathered slab, was a new symbol, a double arrow crossing perhaps the Shadow Weaver's seal or a warning. Jed couldn't tell. A shovel of wind swept dust into their faces, and Caleb's teeth clicked as he steadied his stance, as if ready to strike at silence itself. In the hush that followed, a voice rose from the stone, not loud but inside, old as memory and twice as patient, a whisper that might have been the Shadow Weaver or the mountain's own heart. It spoke of balance, of healing without barter, of letting the land decide what to mend and what to let go. Jed felt the old pull, the ache in his bones that wished for the price of secrets. But Caleb stepped closer, his gaze steady, not pleading. The obsidian vein appeared at last, a seam in the rock that glowed faintly with a star-like light, not black so much as containing all the night that lived in Cottonwood Creek. When Caleb reached out, the vein pulsed as if breathing, and images flickered lost, recovery, a child laughing in sunlight, a blizzard of ash over the pines of his homeland. He bowed his head and whispered that he sought not gold, but a cure for what had broken him, and the mountain answered in a tremor through Jed's feet. Out of the corner of his eye, Jed saw a mirror-like shard detach itself from the vein and hover, not threatening but waiting, like an unspoken offer. The shadow in the peak seemed to lean toward them, offering both trial and mercy, a choice too large for a single heart to bear alone. They turned back toward Cottonwood Creek together, the sun sinking low enough to cast long inward shadows, and Jed knew the town would hear of their decision sooner than they would tell it. If they walked back with nothing but breath and a secret, it would still be enough to wake the town from its sleep and begin mending what time and drought had wronged. They turned back toward Cottonwood Creek, the peaks giving one last sigh like a sleeping beast. The air cooled, and the red dust settled into a quiet map on the ground. Jed's steps slowed only to let the breath catch, then resumed with stubborn rhythm. Caleb walked beside him, shoulders squared against a wind that kept trying to blow fear into him. The old stories about the Shadow Weaver rose again in Jed's chest, a mix of caution and a stubborn glimmer of hope. A coyote paused and listened, then melted into the grasses, leaving only the echo of its howl behind. At the town's edge, the cottonwoods rustled, as if Cottonwood Creek itself was leaning closer to hear their tale. Jed knelt for a heartbeat to touch the ground, feeling the old veins of mineral dust run cold beneath his palm. He told Caleb softly that some bargains are paid with memory as much as with coin, and mercy is the sharpest drill of all. Caleb's gaze drifted toward the black slopes of the peaks, where the air seemed to hold its breath. The wind shifted again, carrying resin, rain, slate dust, and the scent of burned sage from Jed's own past. From between two pines stepped a figure, thin as smoke, eyes bright with a patient, ancient fire. He was the Shadow Weaver, neither holy man nor merely myth, but something that knew the heartbeat of the land. His voice came not from the mouth, but from the space between syllables, inviting them to listen to what their hearts were asking, not what their heads could justify. He warned them that healing and fortune come at a cost, the cost of a memory they might prefer to forget, or a hope they'd rather not name aloud. Caleb confessed that the wound in his arm was a reminder of a choice he'd made to stay alive, even if it meant living with the egg. Jed admitted his dream of the obsidian vein wasn't greed, but a wish to cut through the drought that had hollowed Cottonwood Creek of its spirit. The Shadow Weaver guided them into a narrow corridor where walls shimmered with veins of glassy black, and the air cooled to a whisper. There, in their reflections within the obsidian, they saw not riches or revenge, but a future where the town's doors would swing wider and the wells would sing again. When they stepped back into the fading light, Cottonwood Creek woke with a gentle murmur, and Jed knew the town would listen to their breath, the secrets, and the first spark of a long, patient return. They pushed deeper into the peaks, the wind thinning to a patient whisper that carried the scent of cold stone. The obsidian walls shimmered like spilled ink, and a faint hum seemed to rise from the mineral itself. In a natural amphitheatre, a spring spoke in a weathered voice, telling Jed and Caleb of what the land would endure to mend a broken thing. Caleb laid his good hand on the vein, testing its pulse, and Jed steadied him with the bite of a memory that wouldn't he let him forget where he'd come from. Out of the dark came a shadow that wasn't quiet. There was soft presence that Jed swore was the Shadow Weaver circling to gauge their resolve. They found the vein itself, a ribbon of glass black ore that throbbed with a pale, lunar light. Jed tucked a handful of shards into his coat, the old dream of profit coding into something heavier and older than gold. Beyond the vein lay a pool of mirrored dark water, peering into it. They saw Cottonwood Creek as it would become if honored, not simply reclaimed by hammer and sweat. The pool offered a bargain in a language of breath and ripple, healed the broken, betrayed away a memory that would one day be a weight upon the town's future. Caleb asked what memory the prize would take, the memory of comrades lost, the memory of the war, or the memory of their own certainty. Jed, who decounted every cost in a life spent listening to the land, warned that some debts were too dear even for a miracle. The Shadow Weaver Essica rose from the pool, promising steadiness, and sighed in exchange for a small confession the truth of why they came. Caleb confessed a longing to be more than a wounded rumour of a man, to be a son the town could rebuild with. Jed admitted he wanted Cottonwood Creek to remember him as more than a stubborn remnant. The vein pulsed harder, as if the mountain itself held its breath, and the rocks around them sang low, patient notes about wells, rails, and rain. Jed pressed a shard into Caleb's palm as a token, a vow that healing would be earned and that no secret would be their weapon. They stepped back toward the mouth of the hollow, the light outside looking almost shy after the dark music of the peaks. The air shifted, carrying a scent of sage and rain yet to fall, and the valley beneath the peaks seemed to lean closer, listening. When they emerged, Cottonwood Creek greeted them with a gentle wind, and a town that made room for their re-entry, as if anticipating a return that would require courage more than coins. Jed spoke aloud to Caleb of a plan not to plunder but to revive wells cleared, a cooperative smithy, a fresh trail to bring bounty back, and a new faith in a future that could be shared. The road back to Cottonwood Creek stretched ahead, and for the first time in years, the town's stores seemed to swing wider on their hinges, not from demand but from a patient, stubborn hope. As they climbed the first switchback, the air grew cooler, and the peaks seemed to lean in, listening. Caleb's grip tightened on the map. The wound in his shoulder ached with every step. Jed kept a weather eye on the ridges, thinking of the hidden vein and the shadows that might guard it. A distant talon-like screech echoed from the canyon as a raptor wheeled above. They found the narrow ledge with the arrow symbol chiseled in rock, ancient as stone, dust motes floating in sunlight. The ground trembled slightly, a whisper of rock beneath boot, as if the mountains breathed. Caleb spoke of his cure again, but Jed cautioned him to listen to the land stories before chasing them. They entered a hollow beneath which lay a spring, its water dark and sweet, tasting of rain and old camps. Jed knelt, cupping water in his hands, murmuring that wells in Cottonwood Creek were fed by old stories too. A figure emerged from the shadows of the hollow, a weathered old man with eyes like flint, the Shadow Weaver, or perhaps a man who claimed such a name. The figure wore a cloak of desert dusk, and his touch seemed to bend the light, making the air cooler. He spoke in a voice that sounded like wind through canyon walls, asking what brings men to this threshold. Caleb stepped forward, hands held not in surrender, but in a way that recognized aim. Student before a teacher, declaring his longing for healing. The Shadow Weaver asked for a token, a memory of Cottonwood Creek's old days, perhaps a ring or a story told around the dying embers. Jed offered the pick from his belt, not a weapon but a symbol of promises kept on a stubborn land. The weaver smiled with a painful beauty, and the air shimmered as if painted with heat and night, revealing a glint of obsidian beneath the rock. The vein was not a vein of metal but a vein of memory, a flow of ancestors' dreams that could knit flesh or fray nerves, depending on intent. Caleb hesitated, then asked for healing for both body and talent, for a future that wouldn't swallow Cottonwood Creek again. Shadow Weaver warned that such power never leaves a place untouched, and to take from the peaks is to owe a debt in whispers. They rose at last with a quiet pact to take only what was needed to restore, to guard the place's stories, and to return to Cottonwood Creek with a plan that could outlive them. They arrived from the edge of the scrub toward the jagged silhouette of whispering peaks. The air grows cooler, and the wind carries a rasping whisper that seems to echo Jed's old memories. Caleb's hand trembles as he tightens his grip on the corroded rein. His wind pulses with a phantom ache. The trail threads through scragged junipers where the ground hums with old mineral mills, now silent. In a hollow beneath a ledge, a torch of sunset catches the obsidian vein, a seam of glass black as a storm's heart. They press forward, and the line seems to lean closer, listening. A figure steps from the rock, a lean silhouette wrapped in robes of cedar bark. The Shadow Weaver, though not in the way a man would stand there. The Shadow Weaver speaks in a chorus of voices, grandfather's voice, a canyon wind, and the tapping of a distant picket white chase the bone of a mountain. Boys, would shine like obsidian shards. To mend a town, not to plunder a vein, says Caleb, surprising himself with resolve. The Shadow Weaver tests them with a riddle of debts the whispers of Cottonwood Creek ring out, promising a return if they swear to give back. They vow, more to themselves than to him, to take only what is needed to heal, to guard stories, and to return with a plan. The vein opens deeper into a chamber where the air glitters with the minerals chill, and the shadows glow faintly blue. Jed finds a shard of obsidian in his palm that hums with old memory and a future promise. Caleb lays a hand on the ground and breathes, feeling the mountains answer with a pulse their debt acknowledged but shared. The Shadow Weaver warns that such power always leaves a mark, and that healing the town will require more than stone, it will demand healing of hearts. They gather a measured handful enough to fortify a clinic, a well, perhaps a windbreak, and leave the rest untouched. As they descend, the desert seems to soften, and distant bells, maybe imagination, maybe a distant water pump, signal the promise of a reawakened place. Back at Cottonwood Creek, Jed sets the obsidian on the counter of the store and begins drafting a plan with Caleb, who no longer looks away from the horizon. They know the debt will hum at night, but for now the town has a faint, new heartbeat, and the peaks keep their watch over them. Two stubborn souls who chose healing over hoarding. Dawn stained the whispering peaks with iron light as Jed and Caleb climbed, boots scraping grit from old scars of the earth. The desert breathes hardest at daybreak, and the wind carries stories of gypsum, sage, and the memory of a town that forgot how to dream. Caleb keeps his right arm strapped, a pale scar mapping the years since the injury, and he moves with a stubborn grace that doesn't invite pity. Shadow Weaver first, then healing, he repeats, almost as a prayer, eyes fixed on a distant, jagged crown. Jed's knuckles whiten around the pick, but he doesn't pull until the map's arrow points up, into a throat of rock. Between scree and ledge, a cluster of black glass glitters, shards catching the sun like a handful of tiny meteors. The obsidian vein seems to ripple, but as if the stone themselves hold their breath when the wind stills. Caleb brushes dust from a tablet tucked into his shirt, a symbol from the Shadow Weaver, Tails then says it feels warmer here, almost alive. The pigs don't give up easily, Jeb mutters, though the line in his eyes says he already suspects that's exactly what they want to do. A distant bell, no church, no pump, just a clear, uncanny note hangs in the air, then fades to a thread of echo. A hawk wheels overhead, then dives, and for a moment the world tilts as if the ground itself shifts to aim their path. They crest a bend and find a natural amphitheater hollowed by time, its center, a shallow pool rimmed with obsidian shards like broken glass stars. The Shadow Weaver's sign appears in carved grooves around the pool, a crescent moon encircling, a needle, a warning, an invitation in one. Jed sets the pick on a rock and studies the pool, thinking of the town's depths that hum at night like a long, low note from an ancient instrument. Caleb lowers his head, whispering a vow to use whatever healing comes here to mend not just bodies, but the soul of Cottonwood Creek. The vein beneath the pool pulses, dark as a midnight seam, and a tremor runs through the mountain as if it breathed.